Hello and welcome back to another video lecture with Mr. King in our study of the Gilded Age. Today we're going to turn our attention to the problems of the Gilded Age, 1877 to 1900. So get ready, take some notes, and please again ask any questions that you might have as we move through this lecture in class, that is. So write them down, bring them to class. So the basic question that we start with is, why did many Americans become gravely concerned with the rise of big corporations and inequality of wealth in the Gilded Age? At least as we get towards 1900, I think this becomes more and more the case. And there's a really simple answer, though it might not make sense to you, but Americans feared becoming Europeanized. So I inserted a map of Europe there on the left to remind you that that is Europe, from where many immigrants were coming, from where the original settlers came, whether they were English or Spanish or Dutch, etc. So throughout our history, we've had a connection, a close connection with Europe. And now, though America broke away during the Great American Revolution, 1776 to 1783, and started a new path into the future, there was a real fear that maybe America wasn't going anywhere new, but it was returning back to the old ways of the old continent, that is Europe, and becoming Europeanized. And what we mean by that really is, if you look at that figure there in the middle, I think you can clearly see a king dressed in an ermine robe with a crown and a scepter. And the idea was that somehow the owners of these big corporations and trusts, the successful businessmen, were really becoming more and more like European monarchs. And you can also see on the far right the idea of a sort of almost like a pyramid or a wedding cake there with different tiers representing the different social classes. And we should remember that the Great American Revolution and the American experiment really with democracy was to eliminate social classes that had existed in Europe and in other civilizations. Think of India, for example. And we were going to do away with that. We were going to live without these social classes. And that's something that, let me come back, that didn't seem to be happening. So again, the fear was we were becoming Europeanized. And was that really consistent with that great American experiment? And again, I'll go back to the preamble to the Constitution, and the first words, "We the people," seem to be replaced by "I, the great industrial baron and corporate chief," if you will. So that's something that we want to take a look at. And what we're going to do now is take a look at sort of 5 issues that really concerned Americans. And so we'll start with issue number 1, the loss of opportunity. And again, think about America and the Great American Experiment, a phrase I'll use often, and that was that in the new continent, the new hemisphere, that is North America, South America too, I suppose, but everything was supposed to be new, and all the old ways and customs were supposed to have been thrown out, discarded, and everybody was supposed to be able to start anew, a fresh start, and that represents opportunity, and that in some way connects, I think, to the American dream that we've talked about. But what Americans became concerned with in this time period, the Gilded Age, and again, especially by about 1900, was there seemed to be a real loss of opportunity. I think President Lincoln, in his words, sometime before his assassination in 1865, and I don't know the exact date, but President Lincoln once said, and I quote, "There's no permanent class of laborers amongst us," end quote. And so Lincoln seems to be suggesting that, hey, you might start out life as a laborer. In fact, Abraham Lincoln himself was a day laborer who then moved up to become a lawyer. And from a lawyer, he became a politician and president. So the idea is the idea of opportunity that really means there's the chance to start over and to move up in society in terms of the work you do, in terms of the money that you earn, and the social status that comes with that. And I guess by 1900, people began to question really whether there was a lot of opportunity. You could look at this very large Homestead steel factory owned by Andrew Carnegie. What happened to individual workers, whether they be small artisan type workers that worked in their homes and workshops or in small companies? They really got crushed, if you will, out of existence by these rather large corporations that you see there. And again, I'm having some trouble with the controls. So what happened to opportunity? What happened to the ability of individuals to work for themselves? Well, they had to then go work most often for these large factories, these large corporations and trusts. So was there enough opportunity? And one writer named P.J. McGuire really saw the crystallization of society more and more into distinct classes, which really kind of hurt the working and or lower classes, and really there wasn't any more upward mobility. Upward mobility, again, will attach that to the American dream. So let's move on to problem number 2. Problem number 2 is the widening gap between rich and poor. On some level, we believe in, I think, the United States, and going back to the American Revolution again, in the equality of opportunity, but not the equality of wealth or money. So let me repeat that. We believe in the equality of opportunity, but not the equality of wealth. So that means everybody has a fair shot in life to become whatever he or she would like to become through hard work, diligence, persistence, grit, determination, etc. The equality of opportunity. And that was something that really began to come into question during the Gilded Age. There was striking evidence that showed the growth of fantastic fortunes for a few versus misery, ignorance, and poverty. The kinds of things Henry George talked about and when he talked about hard times in his idea of poverty amidst wealth. And what you see here is, so the successful, very super wealthy people built themselves rather large houses. You can see the estate called the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, and I believe that was the Vanderbilts, if I'm not mistaken. But you can also see then on the right-hand side, immigrant housing in New York City. So entire families of many people crammed into one room with all of their worldly possessions. You also see this Harper's Weekly. It was a very widely read magazine, and you can see this sort of, and it's hard to see, I understand, maybe I'll show it in class, but a wealthy couple taking a walk along the street and kind of peering at this indigent, that is poor, family that's kind of living, it seems, on the street and begging. So the idea of this growing gap began to concern people. And one writer named John O'Reilly said this: "What is the good of having a republic unless the mass of people are better off than in a monarchy?" So again, the United States is a democratic republic. We're not a monarchy. But as John O'Reilly said, what's the good of having a democracy if in fact only very few people enjoy success and wealth, while the majority are left in poverty, ignorance, and misery? And here's a statistic, or a couple of statistics, and you might want to jot these down. By 1890, the top 1% of the population in the United States owned 51% of the overall wealth, whereas the lowest 44% of the population owned 1.5% of the wealth. That is what we call a gap between rich and poor. That is called income inequality, where the top 1% owns 51% of the wealth and the bottom 44% owns only 1.5% of the wealth. By the way, if you think that this is a problem that's gone away in the early 21st century, our century, the top 7% of U.S. households owned 66% of the nation's wealth. So while it's not as bad as it was in the Gilded Age, I would argue that it's not significantly better. All right, moving on then to question number 3. So I guess the question is, what do we do about inequality? And Americans believe in inequality of opportunity, not equality of wealth. But I also believe that on some level, Americans reject the idea that only a very few should be wealthy, while, again, the masses should languish in poverty. So moving right along, problem number 3 that Americans had or saw was that big business corrupted democracy. That is, capitalism trumped we the people. There were any number of big scandals involving government officials and businesses and corporations. One happened to be what was known as the whiskey ring. And so there was a group of whiskey distillers that was able to corrupt the United States Treasury and not pay taxes and therefore benefit. And so government officials working and obviously taking kickbacks. So you can see the bags of money in the whiskey ring boss's hands there. Another one was the government protection, for example, of railroads that were being built all over the country, where railroad companies would receive lands from the government for favorable terms, that is, cheap land. They would also receive government-backed loans to construct these large, vast railroad networks, and in return, the railroads would pay Congress people, elected officials that is, kickbacks and bribes, and there was one such scandal called the Credit Mobilier scandal that came to light in 1872. You can also see there on the far right, that's John Rockefeller, the owner of the Standard Oil Company that controlled 90% of the oil market, and in fact he's holding the White House in his hand, and in the White House he sees there's bags of money. So the idea is, where did that money come from? How did the money get into the White House? And clearly the artist is trying to suggest that the big businesses have in fact corrupted the president himself and bought the White House. And in the background you can see that the United States Capitol, the home of Congress, has become a big, massive smoke belching oil refinery, so that we see oil barrels. So we see that the big businesses have completely taken control of, dominated, and corrupted the government that is supposed to, on some level, work for the welfare of the people, protect the people, but that more and more was not the case at that time. And one other thing that I could add quickly is that the courts, and especially the Supreme Court, began to really favor big businesses over local interests and the welfare of the people. And there was a famous case in 1886, the Santa Clara County versus the Southern Pacific Railroad, in which Santa Clara County out in California had passed regulations to restrict the operations of the Pacific Railroad. The railroad then argued that this was unfair, that these regulations were hurting business and costing them money, and that this was illegal and unconstitutional. So they went to court, and the case moved all the way up to the Supreme Court in 1886, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the railroad company, saying that the Southern Pacific Railroad was a person. Yes, it was a company, a corporation, but it had a body and was a person, and that the regulations enacted by Santa Clara County only applied to railroads, not to people. Think about that. The regulations enacted by Santa Clara County to protect the welfare, to protect nature, whatever they were, only applied to railroads, and the railroad company argued that it wasn't a railroad, it was a person, and the Supreme Court agreed. Now that seems, completely silly and preposterous to me, but that's what happened. And again, remember, history is often full of surprises, and this is kind of a big surprise. And after 1886, in this case and in another case called the Wabash case, we're going to see that the Supreme Court regularly sides with the interests of business over the interests of the people. And this is going to be one of those ongoing conflicts and tensions. So some Americans became really concerned that our democracy, again, the democratic experiment, was not faring too well. Moving right along, and we'll finish up very soon. The fourth issue is aristocratic arrogance. And as wealthy and successful and rich people, sometimes they lose sight and lose touch with common people. And William H. Vanderbilt, the owner of the vast railroad network, was once quoted to a journalist as saying, "The public be damned." The journalist was kind of asking, well, Mr. Vanderbilt, why don't you do this? Doesn't it serve the public interest if you have a railroad line that goes here and not there? And Vanderbilt simply said, "The public be damned." His attitude was he was in business to make money for his company and for himself, not to serve the needs of the public. Great attitude, right? Jay Gould, another owner of railroads and a financier who had become very wealthy on the stock market, and we already saw this, said that I pay half the working class to kill the other half. Not half, but other half. And again, you can see that the complete disregard of this group of individuals for people is kind of shocking. And you can also then see what some of the wealthy people did with their money, and we know this, we've seen this, but it was called conspicuous consumption. That is, they built rather large mansions, they threw lavish parties for themselves and their friends, they traveled to Europe on great big vacations that lasted months and months, and so they kind of lost touch with the ordinary people, and again, that great gap separating the wealthy and the not so wealthy. And the last thing is labor unrest, and we already saw some of that in a previous lecture. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.